On the night of August 21st in 1942, a few minutes before midnight, Captain John Hightower crouched low behind a wet ridge on Guadalcanal with the thick jungle mist sliding in slow waves across the ground ahead of him. The air was heavy with heat and moisture wrapping around him like a steaming blanket, while thin spirals of fog rose from the soaked earth. About 200 yards away, dark shapes shifted between trees and tall brush, whispering to each other in low Japanese voices that blended into the night. Hightower held his breath for a moment, listening carefully, then wiped sweat from his brow and leaned closer to the squat 37mm anti-tank gun that sat beside him like a silent guardian. At 31 years old, he had spent months training with this weapon, learning how to push it far beyond its original purpose. It was designed to punch holes through steel plating, not human bodies, yet tonight that purpose was about to change. Sergeant Eddie McCullough, his gunner, gave the breech one last check under the faint glow of starlight. He slid a strange round into position, one that looked like a normal shell, but inside carried something the Japanese army had never witnessed on any battlefield. Packed tightly within were 122 steel balls, each the size of a marble, waiting to burst outward in a violent storm the moment the round cleared the muzzle. For months, Japanese forces had spread fear throughout the Pacific with their fierce Banzai charges. These were not ordinary attacks, but waves of shouting soldiers rushing forward at full speed with rifles and bayonets, ready to tear through anything in their path. Tales of these human waves had traveled across every American outpost from China to the Philippines. Soldiers spoke with dread of hundreds of Japanese troops charging together, using sheer will and courage to break defensive lines and crush morale. Those who survived such assaults described them as nightmares where gunfire barely slowed the attackers and battles often dissolved into desperate hand-to-hand combat. Now on Guadalcanal, over 1,000 Japanese soldiers from the 17th Infantry Division were preparing the largest Banzai charge the island had seen. Their commanders believed that tradition and overwhelming force would sweep the Americans aside and reclaim the strategic ground they had lost. But Hightower and his gun crew had a different answer waiting for them. The gun was not loaded with the armor-piercing shells it usually fired. Instead, McCullough had prepared an M2 canister round a creation that turned the anti-tank weapon into something far deadlier at close range. When the round fired, it would break open almost instantly and release a spreading cone of steel that could rip apart anything standing within 200 yards. The Japanese attackers hidden behind the tree line had no idea they were walking toward a weapon that could turn their boldest tactic into their downfall. The first hints of Japanese movement began earlier at 1800 hours, when Marine scouts along the Lunga River reported growing enemy activity deeper in the jungle west of Henderson Field. Hightower had received the message while wiping down the barrel of his gun, still warm from a test firing earlier in the day. The news was short and unsettling. A large enemy force, possibly a full battalion, was advancing eastward, using the approaching darkness as cover. This information only confirmed what American commanders suspected for days. A major attack was coming, and it would strike the heart of the defensive line before dawn. Far to the west, General Harukichi Hyakutake had spent weeks forming this plan. His 17th Infantry Division had struggled since the Americans landed 6 weeks earlier. Supplies were scarce and could only arrive on fast-moving boats that dashed along narrow waters at night to avoid American bombers. Many of his soldiers were weak from poor rations, malaria, and exhaustion. Still, Hyakutake believed that a swift, overwhelming assault could change everything. If his men seized Henderson Field, Japanese aircraft could return to the island, giving them a powerful foothold in the Solomon Islands. Yet the Banzai charge was more than a matter of desperation. It was a deeply rooted tradition born from samurai ideals and modern military doctrine that placed spiritual strength above material disadvantage. Japanese soldiers were trained to believe that courage and will could break any line. From Nanking to Manila, this tactic had shattered opposing forces again and again. Officers in Hayekutek's ranks were confident that American Marines, though brave, had never faced the full ferocity of a massed band's "I charge." They believed that 1,000 screaming soldiers bursting from the trees under the cloak of night could crush American defenses before they had time to react. Lieutenant Kenji Okata gathered his company beneath the dripping canopy as warm rain began falling in thick sheets. His men were already prepared with bayonets fixed to their rifles and black charcoal smeared across their faces to blend into the night. They carried only what they needed for the first assault: rifles, grenades, and minimal ammunition. Speed was everything. Once they broke through the American line, they planned to seize weapons and continue the attack without slowing. On the ridge above the jungle approach, the Marines had shaped their positions carefully. Machine guns, mortars, and rifle pits formed interlocking lines of fire designed to funnel any attack into specific zones where the defenders could unleash their full strength. Hai Totawa and his 37mm gun sat at the very center of this defensive arc, overlooking a natural clearing about 150 yards wide. The anti-tank gun rarely met armored vehicles on Guadalcanal, but Hai Totawa had spent weeks learning how to use M2 canister rounds, turning the gun into the deadliest short-range weapon on the island. Each round unleashed 122 steel balls in a deadly spray capable of wiping out entire groups of charging infantry. As darkness deepened, the jungle fell silent. Birds quieted, and even the insects slowed their buzzing as if sensing the growing tension. Marines checked their weapons one final time, listening for the first sign of the assault they knew was coming. Then at 0150 hours, the Japanese began to move, and the night prepared to explode. Each Japanese infantryman crouched beneath the dripping trees with only the barest equipment on his back: a rifle, a bayonet, 2 grenades, a single pouch of ammunition. Their officers had drilled into them that weight slowed a charge and that speed and shock created victory. Once they punched through the American line, they planned to grab fallen weapons and push onward without hesitation. Lieutenant Okata, who had fought in China, remembered watching entire groups of defenders break apart at the sight of massed Japanese soldiers rushing with fixed bayonets and battle cries that thundered across the plains. He believed the same tide of fear would rise here on Guadalcanal. His men believed it as well. They tightened grips on their rifles and waited for the signal that would send them racing into the darkness. On the ridge overlooking the jungle clearing, the Marines had spent long hours shaping a defense designed to trap an enemy assault into narrow corridors of fire. Barbed root stones and packed earth shaped their firing lines into a curve that swept across the ridge front. They had stacked ammunition behind each fighting hole and checked weapon sights again and again until every Marine knew his exact field of fire. Captain Hai Totawa had placed his 37mm gun at the most crucial point, a natural funnel that led from the thick jungle into a broad open space where any assault would be fully exposed. He knew that here the gun could make its greatest difference. The 37mm M3 anti-tank gun was never intended for this kind of battle. It was built to punch through steel hulls of light Japanese armor rather than stop waves of infantry. But on Guadalcanal, the thick jungle rarely allowed tanks to advance. Instead, Hai Totawa had spent weeks experimenting with the M2 canister round. It carried 122 steel balls inside a thin metal shell designed to burst the instant it left the barrel. When fired, it created a giant shotgun blast that could tear through massed infantry out to 150 yards and still wound out to 200 yards. The weapon turned an open clearing into a death zone, and Hai Totawa knew exactly how to use it. Sergeant McCullough had trained his crew until they could operate the gun in complete darkness. They learned to load by touch, to aim by muscle memory, to read the terrain by the faint glimmer of moonlight on the ridge. The gun weighed 900 pounds, yet 6 men could push it into position when needed. Its stability allowed rapid fire without losing accuracy. McCullough worked the sight. Private Miller handled the loading. 2 more Marines waited behind them in a shallow trench, ready to run ammunition forward the instant they were called. Their lives depended on speed and precision. As midnight neared, the jungle changed, bird calls faded. The constant hum of insects slipped into silence. It was as if the entire forest held its breath. Marines adjusted helmets and gripped rifles. Machine gun crews swung barrels left and right, checking smooth motion on their mounts. Mortar teams whispered range numbers to each other. The entire ridge felt the tightening tension of an unseen storm building beyond the tree line. At 0150 hours, the Japanese began their movement. They shifted with practiced stealth despite their growing numbers. Hundreds of boots pressed into the mud without sound. Officers whispered once to give direction, then faded into shadows among their men. The assault front stretched nearly half a mile wide from tree to tree. The plan required simultaneous strikes at several American positions so that defenders could not concentrate fire. If even one point weakened, follow-up forces would exploit the gap and crash through into the heart of the Marine line. Lieutenant Okata held his company at the center of the advancing formation. If he broke through, the entire American ridge would unravel. He did not know that the 37mm gun waited directly ahead, nor did Hightower know that Okata himself led the central thrust. Both men were moving toward a collision neither could avoid. The first sign for the Marines was a low rumble. At first it seemed like the distant roll of thunder, but soon the sound formed into voices. Hundreds of voices chanting in deep rising tones. The chant grew louder and more menacing as the Japanese soldiers worked themselves into the spiritual frenzy needed for a suicidal charge. American sentries raised rifles and whispered warnings down the line. Shadows appeared between trees. Dark shapes moved without concealment now. Stealth had ended. The attack had begun. Machine gun crews leaned forward. Rifle bolts snapped into place. Every Marine felt the pounding of his own heartbeat as the jungle ahead transformed into a wall of moving shapes. This would be the moment where samurai spirit attempted to overpower American steel. 3 months earlier, the 37mm guns had arrived on Guadalcanal. They came from the Rock Island arsenal, where engineers designed them to pierce the armor of Japanese Type 95 tanks. The weapon had a semi-automatic breech that allowed rapid loading and firing. A skilled crew could fire 15 rounds in a minute with accuracy out to 1,000 yards against armor. A 3-inch thick bore could punch through 25mm of steel at 500 yards, which was more than enough to destroy the thin metal plating of Japanese tanks. Hightower first saw the M2 canister round during training at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. Instructors demonstrated its power against wooden targets shaped like enemy soldiers. When the round burst open at 50 feet, it sent steel balls into the targets with such force that entire rows toppled at once. It was not elegant, it was not graceful, it was simply devastating. Now on this ridge it would face its greatest test. The Japanese were coming in numbers few Marines had ever witnessed. Their voices rose in a frightening chant. Their steps quickened. Their weapons glinted faintly under the light of a clouded moon. The battlefield was seconds away from erupting. The M2 canister round that rested inside the breech of the 37mm gun was a carefully engineered creation shaped to unleash the most destructive short-range blast the Marines had ever used. The round measured 3 inches across and nearly 5 inches in length, holding its deadly cargo of steel spheres within a thin metal shell. Each sphere was crafted with precision, no larger than a marble and weighing a fraction of an ounce, but capable of tearing through bone and muscle with terrifying force. When fired, the round traveled only 50 feet before a timed fuse triggered the casing to burst open, spraying the steel balls outward in a widening cone. By the time the swarm reached its maximum spread, it could cover nearly 30 yards across, turning the clearing into a wide killing field. Each steel ball flew at nearly 1,500 feet per second, giving it enough energy to punch through a human body and keep going. Engineers studied war records from earlier centuries, noting how grapeshot shattered infantry formations during the Civil War. They then improved the idea by using perfectly shaped steel balls instead of crude iron scraps. Factories in Detroit produced these balls with strict tolerances so that every sphere behaved exactly like the others when fired. This uniformity created a reliable storm of metal with each shot. Nothing about the round was random. It was a scientific weapon built for absolute devastation. Sergeant McCullough knew these details better than most Marines. He had worked as an artillery instructor before deploying to the Pacific. He had run the numbers himself. He understood that a single canister round fired into enemy troops, spaced a few feet apart, could hit every man in a 60-yard front if the aim was right. The balls kept deadly speed out to 200 yards, but McCullough favored closer impacts around 75 to 120 yards where the cone stayed tight and lethal. In this range, the blast did not scatter too widely. Instead, it tore through anything in front of the barrel in a focused sweep. The gun offered advantages that indirect fire weapons did not. Mortars and howitzers required observers to adjust aim and call in corrections. But the M3 gun allowed the crew to see everything with their own eyes. They could watch enemy shapes move through the jungle. They could adjust their aim in real time. Even in low night light, the gun sight allowed McCullough to track movements with trained steadiness. In the day, he could place a round within a few yards of his mark at 300 yards. At night, it was harder but not impossible. Private Miller had memorized each step of the loading drill. He handled the 2-pound rounds carefully so their thin casing did not dent or crack. When the gun fired, the breech snapped open with a sharp metallic sound, ejecting the empty casing and making space for Miller to slide in the next round. They could fire 12 rounds per minute if forced to, but usually they fired in short bursts to prevent the barrel from overheating. Every second mattered, every step mattered. One mistake could slow the deadly rhythm that the situation demanded. Ammunition had always been a concern for High Totawa. Each gun position held 50 rounds stored in waterproof cases buried near the firing pit. Of those, 30 were canister rounds and 20 were armor-piercing shells meant for tanks that would likely never appear in this jungle. Resupply during battle would be dangerous. Runners could only carry 2 rounds at a time across 200 yards of open ground exposed to enemy fire. High Totawa knew the gun needed accuracy and discipline to avoid wasting ammunition, because once the supply was gone, there would be no second chance. Japanese scouts had not discovered the hidden anti-tank guns. They had seen rifle pits and machine gun nests, but the carefully camouflaged 37mm weapons remained unseen under branches and heavy brush. Because of this, the Japanese commanders assumed that their soldiers would face only rifles and light machine guns. Threats their bands, charges had overcome in previous campaigns. They did not anticipate a weapon built to unleash a storm of steel at close range. The final hours before the attack were tense and heavy. The gun crew had run their drill repeatedly, McCullough sighting, Miller loading, others ready to carry ammunition forward at a moment's notice. The men worked silently. There was nothing left to say. High Totawa moved along the ridge, checking each fighting position, talking through final instructions, and ensuring every Marine knew the plan. The 37mm gun was powerful, but it had limits. It could not fire over obstacles. It could not protect dead space close to the line. That meant the Marines depended on machine guns and rifles to stop any Japanese soldiers who slipped through the storm of canister rounds. Each weapon had a role, each man had a purpose. As the night deepened, the Japanese voices grew louder. Before long, the entire jungle ahead seemed to rumble with chants. McCullough made subtle adjustments to the traverse and elevation of his weapon. The first canister round rested in the breech ready to fire at a moment's notice. Miller crouched beside him with gloved hands resting on the next round. Everything was prepared. At 047 hours, Lieutenant Okota raised his sword high into the air and unleashed the battle cry that echoed across the clearing. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers burst from the tree line. Their voices merged into a thunderous roar that shook the darkness. They surged forward in human waves, their bayonets glinting faintly under the dim light. Their boots splashed through mud and water. Their momentum was terrifying. Captain Hightower watched it all through his binoculars. He counted the soldiers, hundreds upon hundreds. The formation stretched 300 yards wide and packed 20 ranks deep. The officers urged the men forward, shouting commands lost beneath the roar of the charge. The scale of the attack exceeded every American estimate. It was the largest Japanese assault yet seen on Guadalcanal. McCulloch tracked the advancing mass. He waited for the right range, 150 yards, 130, 120. His finger tightened on the trigger. The jungle was about to explode. The gun crew had repeated their firing drill so many times that their bodies moved without thought. Every action flowed smoothly from one step to the next. McCulloch handled the sight. Miller managed the loading. 2 ammunition carriers waited behind them in the shallow trench, ready to rush forward the moment a new round was needed. A 5th Marine crouched beside the field telephone, linking their position to Captain Hightower's small command post a few yards away. Their setup was precise and efficient, but the gun itself carried one major weakness. It could only fire where the barrel pointed. It could not lob shells over hills or obstacles. It could not reach behind cover. If Japanese soldiers slipped too close into the dead ground, just in front of the ridge, the 37mm gun could not stop them. Because of this limitation, Totower had placed machine gun nests and rifle pits on both sides of his weapon to seal gaps and catch anything the canister rounds missed. Every part of the defense relied on another, and Totower had woven them into a single deadly structure. The Japanese chanting grew louder. The sound spread through the trees and rolled across the clearing like a tide of thunder. McCulloch took a steady breath. He made the smallest adjustments to elevation and traverse, making sure nothing stuck or dragged. The first canister round sat in the breech waiting. Miller was crouched beside a short stack of rounds, his loading gloves on, and his eyes fixed on the barrel. Hightower moved from one gun position to another, checking each crew with a short nod and a firm word. No man needed encouragement. They all understood what was coming. The Banzai charge that had frightened so many defenders across Asia was now racing toward them through the shadows of Guadalcanal. At 047 hours, everything erupted at once. Lieutenant Okota raised his sword high and let out a piercing battle cry that ripped through the jungle. More than 1,000 Japanese soldiers burst from the trees with a roar so deep and fierce that it shook leaves loose from branches overhead. Their voices merged into one unstoppable wave of sound. They charged forward as a single furious mass boots, slapping through mud and water bayonets gleaming in the dim starlight. It looked less like an army and more like a living storm, hurtling toward the ridge with absolute abandon. Captain Hightower watched through his binoculars as the charge grew larger and larger. He counted the ranks. He counted the files. The formation stretched nearly 300 yards across and ran 20 ranks deep. Officers dashed among their men, shouting orders and urging them onward. The scale was staggering. It exceeded every previous estimate by nearly half. This was the largest Japanese assault ever attempted on Guadalcanal. They had committed almost everything to this single desperate strike. McCulloch followed the advancing wall of bodies through his sight. He ignored the roar of rifles and machine guns that began opening up all along the ridge. He focused purely on range, 150 yards, 140, 130. Japanese soldiers fell under machine gun fire, but gaps closed instantly as more men surged forward over the bodies. The charge did not slow. If anything, it grew faster. The front line reached 120 yards. McCulloch squeezed the trigger. The 37mm gun kicked back with a violent jolt. The muzzle flash exploded in a blinding burst of white light, illuminating hundreds of furious faces mid-charge. 50 feet from the barrel, the canister round burst open, sending 122 steel balls screaming outward at incredible speed. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The center of the Japanese formation simply vanished. Men who had been sprinting with bayonets raised were torn apart in a heartbeat. Bodies collapsed mid-stride. Some were thrown backward. Others were carried forward by their own momentum before falling in twisted heaps. The blast carved a massive gap 30 yards wide through the assault line. Miller was already slamming the second round into the breach as the first empty casing clattered onto the ground. McCullough fired again 8 seconds after the first. Another storm of steel balls cut through a fresh section of attackers. More bodies went down, more screams filled the night. Japanese soldiers who had survived the first shot paused in shock, tripping over mangled corpses and sliding through mud slick with blood. They had never seen anything like this. Lieutenant Okata felt the blast rip through the air beside him. A steel ball tore his uniform sleeve open without touching his skin. He stared in disbelief as entire segments of his company disappeared in sprays of red mist and torn bodies. Soldiers who had trained under him for years were now crumpled in the dirt. Men who had survived battles in China fell without even raising a rifle. Yet still, the survivors pushed forward, driven by duty and momentum, even as the ground around them became a nightmare of shredded limbs and broken forms. McCullough fired a third round. This one struck a cluster of soldiers who had bunched together while trying to navigate around the fallen. The hit was so powerful that some men were lifted from their feet before crashing down again. The crew moved with perfect rhythm. Aim, fire, eject, reload, aim again. Miller pushed round after round into the breach as quickly as the gun could take them. The semi-automatic mechanism worked flawlessly, allowing a rapid stream of deadly blasts that spread across the clearing. Other Marines joined in. Machine guns rattled in long, bright lines of tracers. Mortars arced overhead with dull thumps landing behind the advancing ranks. Rifles cracked in steady rhythm. The air filled with flashing light and rolling thunder. Japanese soldiers who somehow survived the canister rounds found themselves caught in webs of rifle fire that cut down anyone still standing. The structured charge that was supposed to break the American line had in minutes become utter chaos. Bodies now covered the ground in layers. Some soldiers crawled forward, refusing to stop even as death closed around them from every angle. Others lay still where they had fallen. The advance slowed, then wavered, then faltered, yet the gun kept firing. The storm of steel continued. The night began to tilt toward a single brutal truth. This charge would not reach the ridge. The first canister hits tore through the front ranks so violently that bodies toppled in every direction. Some soldiers dropped instantly as multiple steel balls ripped through them. Others stumbled forward a few more yards before their bodies gave out, and they collapsed in the mud. The ground looked as if a giant blade had swept across it, leaving behind a wide broken scar of dying and dead men. That 30-yard gap carved by the opening blast was only the beginning. Private Miller rammed the next round into the breach the instant the casing ejected. The semi-automatic action snapped shut with a sharp metallic sound. McCullough adjusted slightly to the left where the next wave pressed forward, unbroken by the carnage around them. He fired again, and the second storm of steel balls tore into another segment of the formation, adding dozens more bodies to the widening path of destruction. Lieutenant Okata struggled to understand the nightmare unfolding before him. He had seen heavy machine guns. He had seen artillery. He had seen disciplined rifle volleys. But he had never witnessed a weapon that erased full sections of a charging line in mere seconds. He felt a steel ball rip through his sleeve close enough to his skin to burn. He saw the men he had trained for years twisting and falling as if swallowed by invisible claws. The thunder of the impacts echoed across the clearing. The screams rose with them, yet the charge did not fully stop. Some soldiers pushed forward from behind, stepping over bodies unable or unwilling to grasp the scale of the destruction happening in front of them. McCullough fired a third time. The cone of steel struck a tight cluster of Japanese soldiers trying to maneuver around the growing mound of dead. The impact lifted some men off their feet. Others collapsed instantly. Those still alive crawled forward with trembling arms, leaving streaks in the mud. The gun crew did not hesitate. Miller loaded again. McCullough aimed again. The gun roared again. Each shot widened the gap. Each shot pushed the center of the charge closer to collapse. The 37mm gun had become the decisive weapon of the night. Meanwhile, the rest of the Marine line had come alive. Machine guns chattered in long bursts, sending bright lines of tracers across the clearing. Rifles cracked steadily. Mortars thumped as shells dropped into the rear ranks of the Japanese assault, adding shock after shock to the unfolding disaster. Japanese soldiers who had somehow survived the initial canister blasts stumbled into interlocking fields of rifle fire. They were struck again and again until they finally fell. The disciplined Marine defense tore apart everything that emerged from the gloom. General Haykutek watched the battle from a distant command point nearly 2 miles away. He saw the bright flashes lighting the clearing. He heard the continuous rumble of American firepower. He listened to the chaotic reports flooding his radios. Something had gone terribly wrong. Lieutenant Okata's transmissions cut off minutes after the charge began. Other officers shouted incomplete messages before their lines went silent. Haykutek realized that the Americans had prepared defenses far stronger and more coordinated than his intelligence officers had understood. This was not a simple line of rifle pits. This was a fortress supported by weapons his troops had never faced. Back on the ridge, McCullough fired his 7th canister round. The Japanese soldiers were now within 70 yards of the Marine line. At this distance, the steel balls struck with full force, still concentrated in a tight cone. The devastation was almost total. The projectiles passed clean through some bodies and struck soldiers behind them. Others shattered bone and tore limbs apart, leaving men barely recognizable. The ground shook from the thundering blasts. The air filled with the thick smell of blood and gunpowder. Even Marines who had seen combat before were shocked by the brutality at such close range. The charge began to falter. Soldiers in the rear ranks stumbled as they reached the massive wall of fallen bodies. The paths forward narrowed into choke points made slippery with blood and broken equipment. Men who had begun the assault with total confidence now struggled in disbelief. The idea that spiritual strength could break through American defenses faded with each second. The Banzai charge had met the full force of modern weapons built not for intimidation, but for instant and overwhelming destruction. Lieutenant Okata lay in the mud barely 30 yards from the Marine line. Multiple steel balls had pierced his chest and abdomen. His sword still rested in his right hand, though his grip weakened. Around him, his company was gone. His soldiers crawled in agony. Some tried to rise only to collapse again. Others dragged themselves forward through sheer will despite wounds that offered no hope of survival. The Banzai charge that was meant to shatter the Marines had instead shattered itself against a wall of steel and fire. Still, some soldiers kept crawling. Some still forced their bodies forward even as their strength drained away. But there was no breakthrough, no moment of triumph, no chance of reaching the American positions. Everywhere they turned, they found only more fire, more explosions, and more death. The clearing that once promised victory had become a massive grave. By dawn, the full scale of the destruction was finally visible. The morning light revealed hundreds upon hundreds of bodies scattered across the ground. Japanese troops lay in dense patterns that matched the deadly arc of the canister blasts. In total, 783 bodies stretched from the tree line to the foot of the ridge. The final tally would be remembered with grim clarity. The Banzai charge had not simply failed. It had been erased. Morning broke slowly over the shattered clearing, revealing a scene so grim that even hardened Marines paused before stepping forward. As the first light pushed through the jungle canopy, the full extent of the Japanese disaster became impossible to ignore. Bodies covered the ground in thick, uneven layers, stretching from the ridge all the way back to the broken tree line. Marine burial teams began moving through the chaos in silence, carrying notebooks and shovels while doing their best not to stare at what the steel balls had done. Many of the fallen had been struck by multiple projectiles, leaving wounds that were nearly indescribable. The Marines worked methodically, counting bodies, collecting any intelligence materials and marking positions. But more than once, young Marines turned away, their faces pale from the horror before them. Captain Hightower walked among the dead with a heavy, slow step, studying everything with an analytical eye rather than emotion. He noted exactly where each canister blast had landed. He examined how the bodies lay in wide arcs matching the lethal spread of the steel balls. He recorded in his memory how the spacing of the rounds created overlapping zones that no infantry in the world could have survived. The canister rounds had worked exactly as designed, perhaps even more effectively than he had imagined during training. His mind focused not on triumph, but on understanding. He was already thinking about how the weapon would perform in the next engagement, because he knew there would be more to come. Far away in the hills, General Hayakutake received the casualty reports with a tightening jaw and a hollow silence that filled his command tent. The numbers confirmed the disaster he had sensed during the night. 3 entire companies had been destroyed. Only 47 men from Lieutenant Okata's command had made it back through the jungle alive, and most were wounded or disoriented. Those who could still talk described a weapon that fired clouds of metal instead of bull. It's a weapon that tore apart entire groups in the blink of an eye. They had never faced anything like it in China or the Philippines. Their voices shook as they spoke, their hands trembled. The psychological shock had cut deeper than the physical wounds. Marine intelligence officers spent the following week interrogating several captured Japanese soldiers. These prisoners described the horror in vivid, trembling detail. One of them, Sergeant Yamamoto, had steel fragments lodged in his shoulder and thigh. He told the Marines how he watched his squad leader disappear in an instant, shredded by multiple impacts. Japanese training had conditioned them to expect rifle fire and machine gun fire. They had believed their spiritual strength and discipline would carry them forward, but nothing in their doctrine prepared them for a weapon that could kill so many men so quickly across such a wide front. Yamamoto said it felt like running into a wall of invisible knives. Word of the American canister weapon spread quickly across Japanese units operating in the Solomon Islands. Fear traveled faster than orders. 3 weeks later at Edson's Ridge, the 9th Company of the 3rd Battalion met the same fate. They attempted a night assault only to lose more than 100 men in under 2 minutes when 3 37mm guns fired in unison. Survivors who escaped carried the story with them like a curse, repeating again and again how the Americans now possessed a devastating new weapon that could erase entire formations. Japanese soldiers who had once charged fearlessly began hesitating at the idea of crossing open ground. Their officers saw the hesitation. Their morale wavered. Captain Hightower wrote detailed after-action reports explaining exactly how the canister rounds were used and how their effectiveness could be improved. He recommended adjusting infantry tactics around the weapon. He noted ideal firing ranges, best placement positions, and the importance of coordinating multiple guns to create overlapping fire zones. His reports traveled through Marine Corps headquarters, influencing decisions faster than anyone expected. His analysis demonstrated that a single 37mm gun firing canister could stop an attack the size of an infantry company if the weapon was positioned well and supplied with enough ammunition. When several guns worked together, their destructive power increased dramatically, leaving no room for an enemy to maneuver. By October of 1942, Marine Corps doctrine had formally changed to reflect these lessons. The newly published training manuals included diagrams showing how to place the guns, how to calculate the spread of the steel balls, and how to time the shots for maximum effect. Artillery schools at Camp Lejeune and Quantico added entire sections on anti-personnel firing techniques. Gunners in training spent long hours learning how to calculate dispersion patterns and select the right ammunition for each situation. The Pacific War was changing, and the Marines were adapting faster than anyone expected. Japanese commanders tried desperately to adjust. General Hayakutake ordered smaller infiltration attacks at night, hoping to avoid the wide canister blast zones. But the Marines used flares and searchlights to expose these movements. Mortar suppression attempts failed because the 37mm guns were easy to reposition and difficult to target. Gradually, the Japanese army began abandoning large-scale Banzai charges, not because they no longer believed in them, but because fear of the canister rounds had seeped into every soldier's mind. American intelligence began reporting that Japanese willingness to launch mass-wave assaults had dropped sharply by early 1943. Sergeant McCullough wrote a letter to his family in Michigan describing the night battle in guarded terms, though military censors blocked the technical details. He told them only that the enemy charge had been enormous and that their weapon had proven decisive. But he also wrote about the haunting sound the steel balls made when they struck human bodies, a wet tearing noise he knew he would never forget. He said that the myth of the unstoppable Japanese warrior had died that night, not in some heroically symbolic moment, but in the cold precision of American industrial power and tactical innovation. His words revealed the emotional weight of what they had witnessed. Medical teams treating Marines noticed something else in the days following the battle. The defenders who had stood behind the 37mm guns during the attack now carried a renewed confidence. They had seen the worst the Japanese army could unleash. They had watched the enemy break upon their lines and fail completely. The fear of hand-to-hand combat diminished. The belief in their weapons rose. A powerful shift took place across the entire regiment. They now knew that no matter how many soldiers charged them, they had the means to survive. The night the Japanese believed would bring them glory instead reshaped the course of the Pacific War. And the ridge where Hightower and his crew stood became a lesson in the raw and brutal truth of modern warfare. The days that followed the failed Banzai assault revealed a shift in the spirit of the Marines on Guadalcanal. Where fear once lingered in the backs of their minds, they now carried a firm sense of confidence born from witnessing the sheer stopping power of their weapons. The knowledge that the 37mm gun and its canister rounds could halt even the most determined enemy charge spread through the ranks like a strengthening wind. Marines who had once worried about desperate close combat now believed they could withstand anything the Japanese army attempted. Their morale rose, their posture sharpened, their faith in survival strengthened. The brutal lesson of that night gave them renewed grit for the long and bitter fight ahead. Hand-to-hand combat casualties dropped sharply as fewer Japanese soldiers ever came close to reaching the Marine lines. The success of the canister weapon began influencing plans far beyond Guadalcanal. In 1943, commanders across the Pacific Theater demanded more 37mm guns and more canister rounds to prepare for coming amphibious assaults. The Rock Island Arsenal expanded production lines to meet this growing need. Workers machined steel balls with exacting precision, ensuring each weighed the same and matched the required diameter. Quality control teams inspected every batch with strict standards. By December of 1943, American forces had more than 50,000 canister rounds available in stockpiles, stretching from New Guinea to the Aleutian Islands. This massive supply effort reflected not only military demand, but genuine belief in the weapon's battlefield dominance. Training programs for new Marines also changed. Recruits practiced loading and firing canister rounds under simulated combat pressure. They learned the ideal ranges. They learned how to adjust their aim for maximum coverage. They learned to fire in bursts to maintain both accuracy and ammunition supply. Gunnery sergeants who had battled on Guadalcanal returned to training schools where they taught the next generation of gunners the hard-won lessons of jungle warfare. These instructors explained how to read enemy movement and how to avoid wasting rounds on scattered targets. They emphasized how one well-timed blast could save an entire platoon. The students listened because these were not theories. These were survival rules forged in real bloodshed. The impact of the canister round extended beyond tactics. It influenced American weapons development programs for years to come. Engineers recognized the value of turning existing guns into devastating anti-personnel tools. Rather than designing entirely new weapons, they created canister variants for larger artillery systems. The 75mm pack howitzer received a round containing 260 steel balls. The 105mm howitzer received a canister round carrying 350 balls. These munitions proved effective in later battles throughout the Pacific, and again in Korea and Vietnam, where enemy forces sometimes used massed infantry tactics similar to the Japanese Banzai charges. As American innovation grew, Japanese morale weakened. Survivors of Guadalcanal carried stories of the steel storms into future battles. They repeated the tale of soldiers being torn apart in seconds. They spoke of a weapon that erased courage with raw mechanical force. Gradually, Japanese commanders abandoned the once sacred Banzai assault as a primary tactic. They shifted toward defensive strategies, hoping to avoid the open areas where canister fire had been so devastating. But the psychological damage had already spread. Japanese soldiers began hesitating before advancing across exposed terrain. Their belief in unstoppable spiritual strength had been cracked by the cold reality of industrial warfare. Captain Haito Tower returned to San Diego in March of 1945, carrying a silver star for his innovation and leadership on Guadalcanal. The medal seemed to him a small symbol for what had been achieved, but he never sought attention. Instead, he accepted a teaching position at the Marine Corps Artillery School. There he spent the rest of his military career training new gunners in the tactics that had reshaped Pacific fighting. He spoke calmly about range and elevation. He explained the importance of terrain. He taught students how to read the battlefield as if it were a living map. Yet he never boasted about his role. To him, the lessons mattered more than the praise. The 37mm M3 anti-tank gun continued to serve in every major Pacific campaign from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Production eventually reached 4,800 units. More than 2 million canister rounds were manufactured across the United States during the war. The gun proved invaluable not only for stopping tanks, but for breaking infantry attacks in jungle's narrow passes and uneven terrain where larger artillery pieces could not operate effectively. It earned a legacy far beyond what its designers originally envisioned. Sergeant Eddie McCullough survived 4 major amphibious assaults after Guadalcanal. He fought on islands where the heat never eased and where every ridge held danger. His service record reflected the long trail of battle from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. When he finally returned home to Michigan in December of 1945, he tried to settle into life as a machinist in Detroit's automotive factories. The precision skills he learned in the Marine Corps served him well. Yet he never spoke about the sound of the steel balls hitting human bodies. He never described the wet, tearing noise that haunted his dreams. Some memories he locked away deep inside, leaving them untouched for the rest of his life. Japanese historians after the war began studying the causes of their battlefield failures. Many focused on the disastrous Banzai charges on Guadalcanal. Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, who survived the war, wrote extensively about how Japanese infantry doctrine had failed to adapt. He described the moment when spiritual determination could no longer outweigh material superiority. He identified the American canister weapon as a turning point, one that forced Japanese leaders to rethink their reliance on emotional strength over tactical analysis. He acknowledged that once soldiers learned the Americans possessed such a devastating tool, their confidence collapsed. Fear replaced certainty, doubt replaced faith. Private Miller completed his service in April of 1946 after participating in 5 amphibious operations. His skill as a loader earned him commendations from 3 different commanders. Yet he did not see himself as a hero. He believed the Marines with rifles and bayonets had the harder jobs. Using the GI Bill, he enrolled in college in Ohio and eventually became a high school mathematics teacher. On rare occasions, he mentioned that he had served in the war, but he never told students or colleagues about the 37mm gun or the thunderous nights when steel storms erased entire enemy units. That part of his life stayed locked in silence. The story of the canister round did not end with the war. Its influence continued shaping military strategies, training programs, and weapons development. It stood as a testament to the brutal truth. that innovation and adaptability could change the balance of war more decisively than courage alone. The lessons learned from the brutal fighting on Guadalcanal did not fade with the passing of time. Instead, they shaped American doctrine throughout the remainder of the war and influenced thinking well into future generations. The success of the 37mm canister round convinced military planners that similar anti-personnel ammunition should be created for other artillery systems. Engineers designed canister rounds for the 75mm pack howitzer, which carried 260 steel balls, and for the 105mm howitzer, which carried 350 balls. These new rounds proved devastating in later conflicts, including Korea and Vietnam, where American forces once again faced mass infantry assaults. The principles discovered in the jungles of Guadalcanal returned on battlefields thousands of miles away, reinforcing the idea that innovation could overpower even the most determined enemy. General Hayekutek, whose command crumbled on Guadalcanal, never recovered from the defeat. After the war, he was taken into Japanese custody while awaiting trial for war crimes. He died in 1947. Years later, his personal writings were discovered. In them, he expressed deep regret for relying on spiritual doctrine rather than realistic assessment of American firepower. He admitted that the Japanese army had failed to adapt to changing conditions and had placed too much faith in traditions that no longer held value on modern battlefields. He believed that if Japanese officers had studied American capabilities more closely, thousands of his soldiers might have been spared. His reflection became a window into the rigid thinking that doomed so many Japanese units during the war. Back in the United States, the legacy of the 37mm gun continued to grow. Even after the war ended, the weapon remained part of the American arsenal through the 1960s. National Guard units used it for training. Artillery instructors demonstrated direct fire principles using the same guns that had once defended ridges and airfields across the Pacific. Some guns were sent to Allied nations through military assistance programs where they fought again in smaller conflicts throughout the Cold War. Their lightweight and reliability made them invaluable tools in rough terrain where heavier artillery could not operate. The gun had survived far beyond its original purpose and continued teaching soldiers long after the surrender of Japan. Museums across the country began displaying examples of the M3 anti-tank gun and its canister ammunition. Visitors walked past these weapons, often unaware of the role they played in transforming the Pacific War. At the National Museum of the Pacific War in Texas, a working demonstration model allowed instructors to show how the gun operated using practice rounds. Safety rules forbid firing real steel balls, yet even the demonstration made clear how powerful the system had been. Educational plaques described both the anti-tank and anti-personnel capabilities, but the full shock of what the canister round accomplished could never truly be captured in a museum explanation. Manufacturing records at the Rock Island Arsenal revealed the extraordinary precision behind each round. Every steel ball had to meet exact measurements down to small fractions of an inch. The machines that shaped them required constant calibration. Skilled workers inspected each batch with trained eyes. This precision was not simply craftsmanship. It reflected the industrial power of the United States and the massive investment behind its war effort. By 1944, American factories produced canister ammunition faster than frontline troops could fire it. Warehouses filled with round after round, ensuring that shortages would never hinder future offensives. Captured Japanese documents after the surrender showed that the psychological impact of the canister weapon reached far beyond Guadalcanal. Japanese officers wrote reports detailing the devastating effects of American anti-personnel artillery. They proposed possible counters such as spreading soldiers farther apart or developing protective gear. But none of these solutions were practical. Japan lacked the industry needed to create effective armor for infantry. They also lacked the luxury of spacing their troops widely because their doctrine relied on mass charges to force breakthroughs. In the end, Japanese commanders knew the truth. The canister round had changed the balance of power in ways they could not overcome. Captain Hightower's innovation on Guadalcanal represented a much larger pattern in the Pacific War. American forces were constantly adapting their weapons and tactics to match the demands of jungle fighting. Engineers and field commanders collaborated to turn existing tools into deadly solutions. Flamethrowers evolved to clear fortified caves. Napalm was developed for dense vegetation. Aircraft adjusted bombing tactics for island targets. Every new challenge led to new methods. It was this flexibility that gave American troops a crucial advantage over an enemy bound by rigid doctrine and long-standing military traditions. The 37mm canister round did not simply kill enemy soldiers. It reshaped thinking across the entire military. Commanders realized that improvisation could be as powerful as technology. A weapon designed to destroy light tanks became one of the most feared anti-personnel tools of the war. It demonstrated that the Americans could change the rules of battle quickly and with decisive effect. This message echoed through planning rooms and briefing halls for years after the war ended. The story of the canister round reached beyond battlefield tactics. It highlighted a harsh truth about the nature of modern warfare. Courage alone could not overcome industrial ingenuity. Strength of spirit could not stop a storm of steel. The Japanese army believed deeply in spiritual power, but on that ridge near Henderson Field, their devotion could not protect them. They charged with absolute certainty only to be erased by a weapon designed with cold mechanical precision. The contrast was stark and tragic. It became a symbol of the wider struggle in the Pacific where tradition met innovation and where innovation proved decisive. The legacy of the 37mm gun extended long after the conflict ended. It represented the triumph of tactical creativity over rigid doctrine. It showed how soldiers like Hightower, McCulloch, and Miller could transform an ordinary weapon into a defining force on the battlefield. The weapon began its life as a tank killer, but evolved into something far greater. It became a symbol of adaptability, a reminder that victory often belongs to those who learn faster and innovate under pressure. In the end, the secret of the canister round was simple. It turned necessity into advantage. It took the desperate defense of a small ridge on Guadalcanal and transformed it into a turning point in the Pacific War. It proved that the smallest changes in design, the smallest adjustments in tactics could alter the fate of thousands. And through that truth, the canister round carved its place in history not only as a tool of destruction, but as a testament to the power of human ingenuity in the darkest hours of war. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.